Welcome, Mr. Thomas Reed.
I'm going to talk today about Operation Neptun, which is one of the most, perhaps the most cinematic disinformation operation of the Cold War. Some of you may have seen my Wired piece on this. I'm going to give you a little more context and a few more fun details today. So even if you read the Wired piece, I hope this will be useful. Everything that I'm showing you today is sourced from the Czech intelligence archives directly and based on either Czechoslovak STB material or KGB memos. And let me put this into context. Everybody here is familiar with the kill chain, from reconnaissance to acting on objectives, the 7 steps. The kill chain, you could say, is missing at least 2 important stages. So let's add stage 0, which is planning. It's actually multiple stages. There's proposal stage, initial planning, a second proposal. Often in history, there were complex multi-proposal stages. And of course, there's then the final phase of evaluating a success of an operation, the assessment of it. Usually from the forensic fingerprints inside a victim network, for example, or even if you have access to C2 infrastructure or more information that you can somehow get in today's context, you will most likely not be able to see the memos before and after the operation. That's a very rare, highly prized intelligence win if you can. But we can do that in history. So let me focus on those stages. And also just say quickly, I don't have to deal with confidence levels here. We have certainty that the operation looked like and actually was planned in a certain way because we can read the actual memos. So I find that quite reassuring occasionally to just know the facts of what happened from the offender's point of view. Now, the operation was planned in 1963 under a man called Igor Agayans. He was a KGB colonel at the time, head of the new disinformation section, and he was a very daring, but also a very bookish, distinguished Armenian officer. He's an iconic figure in the history of Russian foreign intelligence today, still today. So he even visited Prague during the operation when this was pulled off. But let's put this into a little bit of context. In the summer of 1963, the world was mesmerized by a mythical hunt for Nazi gold in an alpine lake, in Lake Toplitz. This is a picture from a German newspaper depicting the Führer Hitler visiting an alpine lake. So the myth was that there are some Nazi treasures hidden in this lake, and everybody reported on it. Like even in the United States, this was a global press story. So the Czechs first observed that story and thought, okay, maybe we can do something with it. They got inspired. And the second thing that I'd like to point out in terms of context is that this was 19 years after the Holocaust, 19 years after the end of World War II. And the Czechs, and in Germany, in West Germany, the statute of limitations of war crimes was about to expire, meaning German war criminals would be able to get away with their war crimes. Clearly, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, in Poland, even in Western neighboring countries, that was not a very welcome development. So the Czechs wanted to create a publicity that would force the German parliament to extend that statute of limitations in order to be in a position also from an intelligence perspective to blackmail Germans. Because if you know their dark secrets, that makes them vulnerable. Okay, so I'm just going to move forward here because there's so much. The Czechoslovaks, then Czech TV actually first had the idea, well, we also have these lakes in mountains that are deep and blue and kind of mysterious because we had Nazis on the lakes during the war. Why don't we do our own treasure hunt for Nazi gold in Bohemia, in the mountains? which they then did. So the TV crew was asking for permission to film in the lake because it was close to the border. They needed permission. And the Ministry of the Interior was also in charge of intelligence. They said, okay, there's going to be a Nazi treasure hunt. So clearly we can put some Easter eggs, so to speak. We can put some Nazi treasure into the lake that actually is not there. So the idea was born to hide fake Nazi documents in that lake and then discover them a week later or shortly after, have them discovered by journalists, and boom, you have this massive story that would achieve the objective and put the West German government under pressure. So this is a picture of the disinformation crew doing the Recon Trip to the lake, the first Recon Trip. In the middle there, you can see Ladislav Bittman, who later defected and wrote about the story. He didn't have those pictures because we just got them released. He's smoking before he goes down into the lake to investigate, how deep is the mud, how deep is the lake, how easy would it be to hide something there. This is sort of a classic Recon Trip. And you can see them afterwards writing this memo. So they took these pictures on that Recon Trip, including the one I'm showing you right now, because they needed to convince their boss, the head of the intelligence service and the minister of the interior, to actually sign off on this crazy plan. And obviously you need some photographic material and some details about the mud in the lake and whatnot to talk to, they did hand-drawn maps of how to get to the lake. This is them on the Recon Trip, actually diving. This is the hand-drawn map that they painted for the minister to get authorization to do this kind of thing. So they went forward. There was some singing and drinking and smoking involved after the Recon Trip, it appears. So they finally got authorization from Strugal, the minister. This is him. And he signed off on this 7-page memo that was exquisitely detailed, spelled out the objective, and spelled out the way to pull off this operation. Signed off by everybody who had the idea, the boss of the disinformation department, the head of the intelligence agency, and so on. This is a picture of the lake taken by them during their Recon Trip. This is an amazing picture. This is the actual drop of the documents in the lake. This is a picture taken in the middle of the night. Apparently, it was a full moon night or something because it was relatively light. This is the head of STB's first chief directorate equivalent, Hauska. He was on the boat. Like this was the career of all these people was on the line that night, because if this failed, they would be in deep trouble. And indeed, the one guy who was wearing the Barber jacket, or some Barber-looking jacket, on the previous slide, he lost one of his fins in the lake when they were down. So they had a brief moment of panic because he lost a fin. Thankfully, then discovered the fin on the way back up. So the level of detail that we have on this operation is just staggering. 2,800 pages. The link to the files is in the resources here. This is a picture of the actual crates of documents in the lake. Now comes the amazing detail. This is a receipt of them buying the fins, just because. The amazing detail is when they actually dropped the files in the lake, they didn't have the incriminating Nazi files that they were looking for. So the Czechs were like, okay, we don't have good material to dump. We have this great plan and we know how deep the mud is, but what are we supposed to put there? So they asked KGB for help in Moscow. KGB said, well, sure, we can send you some Nazi files because we took, Red Army took so many Nazi files when we came to Berlin, Nazi intelligence files, even from the SS, Reichssicherheitshauptamt for the Germans in the audience. But KGB said it's going to take us a bit of time to get this material to Prague. So the Czechs said, okay, why not just dump empty paper into the lake so we have at least the weight right of the boxes, and then pull out the empty paper and seize the boxes immediately after the press discovers them. So that's what they did. They even found actual Nazi explosives, detonated them nearby. There was a crater from the detonation, and they thought this is fantastic because there's actual drama, makes the story better. They found a Nazi helmet, they found a Nazi rifle. This is all great developments. The pictures from the staged treasure hunt looked amazing, as you can see here, with like really fancy diving gear. They jumped in, looked for the crates, got them out, shipped them back to Prague in a motorcade. By the way, nobody knew this was all fake. The people driving in the motorcade, they thought this is all real, obviously. Then, to keep the deception up, they gave the fake boxes, they were like artificially made to look old, to an engineering unit, because the problem is maybe they contained explosives. So the engineering unit took a cobalt picture, kind of an X-ray picture of the boxes, didn't find explosives. Then they pulled them open in a trench so they wouldn't be, just in case, wouldn't be injured by an explosion. And then wrote a long memo about the opening of those boxes. Now think about this for a moment. The ministry really disinformed itself. The deception was so well thought through and was so kept so secret that the entire the engineering unit and everybody else was really not in on the deception. So they waited for a long time. There was already a good amount of press coverage, and no files came from Moscow, because KGB really took its time. It's a large bureaucracy. So then finally, 5 days before the press conference in September, this is now months later, this memo arrives from a courier arrives, and he brings a memo with him from KGB. This is in Russian. KGB, outlines the documents, 30,000 pages of documents. By the way, also have a link to the 30,000 pages of documents in the resources here. You can actually pull them up. Some amazing, crazy stuff in there from the Nazis, like a plan to sink London into the ocean through an artificial earthquake. I mean, you couldn't make this up. But so the Czechs didn't have time really to forge anything in those 5 days. They got 30,000 documents from the first chief directorate at KGB, and then discovered this. They discovered that on some documents they had Russian Cyrillic notes. Can anybody, by the way, read the Cyrillic handwriting here? I could not find anybody who can help me understand what it says. But basically the Czechs are like, this makes no sense, because if this was a forgery, they didn't know if KGB maybe forged the Nazi documents. This is, just to spell that out, this is Czechoslovak, Soviet bloc intelligence distrusting their own brotherly KGB partner agency because they're in the business of forging documents, disinformation. So they thought, okay, this is a German document with Cyrillic notes. Surely no Russian forger, no Soviet forger would ruin the forgery by writing in Cyrillic across the paper. So they basically authenticated the documents as real because of that weird detail. Interesting also is, how did they measure the effect? They collected all the press clippings, Germany, from Italy, from even Japan. All the embassies were sending in press clippings about the operation from the UK, from Italy, from France. Obviously, this is a global operation. Huge amounts of press clippings. It's all in the files, and even they hand painted a tree of press clippings where they all happened, and especially highlighted those in the United States, of course, as well. New York Daily Herald Tribune also covered the story, the AP. So interesting here is one feature that I'd just like to tease out as I'm closing my short presentation here. This is always at risk of talking too much about this story because it is so crazy. But at some point in the case files, we can find a memo from KGB, from actually Agayants's boss, the head of the first chief directorate, congratulating the Czechoslovaks, STB, for their success in Operation Neptun. Because Germany actually did extend its statute of limitations, which was a major achievement, the Czechs argued to KGB. And KGB said, great, you did it. This was successful. We dumped the documents in the lake. I mean, we didn't, but we pretended we did. You pulled them out and it all worked. And this is a remarkable thing because, I grew up in Germany. I'm German, and I can tell you this operation was not what caused Germany to extend the statute of limitations of war crimes. Almost every German family had these conversations. What did you do during the war? I mean, I had those conversations with my grandparents even later. So the notion that some Czech active measure in some distant lake that had got a little bit of press coverage would really move the needle here is fanciful. It's like pouring a bucket of water on a moving glacier, if you like. There was a cultural shift underway in Germany. But let me highlight, this is a key feature here. The aspect of, this is the memo that I'm mentioning, the aspect of disinformation directed towards yourself when you run these operations at scale. So let me quote to you Bittman in his own voice. I talked to him, the gentleman who did the dive in the lake, actually who had the idea for the whole operation in the first place. And I asked him, how do you measure the effects of this kind of operation? What's the measuring of effects actually like from an operator's point of view? And this is what he said.
You can never measure the degree how much you influenced this, whether it was 20%, 30%, or whatever. You have no reliable measurement device. So usually when the operation succeeded in achieving what was officially proclaimed in the beginning, that it would be the objective, if most of it was achieved, then the final report was we totally achieved the goal and blah, blah, blah. The Americans were hurt and claiming the whole.
So, yeah, I thought it was pretty impressive to, he was quite old at the time, was very, very astute, alert and sharp when I talked to him in 2017. And essentially highlighting here the risk of self-deception as a result of running these kinds of operations at scale. I believe there is a pattern there, and I would close here and maybe take a few questions.
Why did you choose to go down this rabbit hole? Is this just a personal, intellectual challenge for you?
You mean the rabbit hole of disinformation history or that specific story?
Both.
When I presented last at the SAS, previous time it was on Moonlight Maze, both times actually, with Juan and Kostin. And just after that presentation on Moonlight Maze, the fancy bear, as it were, started hitting in the US election interference. And I was obviously keenly watching the show and very quickly realized that I was not prepared to understand the historical component of these operations. What I mean by these operations is not espionage, but actually active measures, disinformation, putting information out there for effect, like leaks. And so I thought to myself, okay, if I'm going to talk about this in one way or the other, I really have to study the history. So I did.
Question from the audience. What aspect of Operation Neptune did you like the most? Was it the idea itself, the way it was done, or something completely different?
I think the whole brazenness of the operation. This is the fascinating part for me is the combination of exquisite planning in these initial memos. They pretended they had it all down, like the whole thing was already pre-planned, and then this extreme improvisation throughout. So you have this mix of exquisite planning and just ad-libbing and improvisation. You have a mix of highly bureaucratic procedures, and also at the same time extremely risk-taking entrepreneurial individuals. And you can see on these pictures they really had a lot of fun doing it. So I'm kind of jealous.
At any point in the research, at any point in your going down these rabbit holes during your investigation, did you get to a point where you didn't know what was true, what was part of the deception, what was right or wrong? Were you getting sucked into it? And how did you get around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had many of these moments. And in fact, many of the operators themselves had these moments. In other operations, you can see it clearly. There's a memo coming from KGB First Chief Directorate to, say, the Bulgarians in Sofia to help them with the specific disinformation operations. But the memo does not spell out where the lie stops and where the truth, or where the truth stops and where the lie begins. That they don't tell that to their partners. So even the people doing it didn't really know where the misinformation began. So the way I got around this problem was by just telling the full story and including the deception as part of the story. And if I didn't have any good reason to believe that I understood, then I would just be honest about this.
Are there any lessons from those old campaigns that you're seeing being repeated today? And are there any lessons from your research and the stuff coming in the book that we can look to and learn to deal with the stuff we're dealing with today?
I think there are many, many different lessons, and many of the stories speak for themselves. Like just one, including the lessons. One is, to me, the level of conspiratorial thinking on display sometimes, really the stacks and layers of deception stacked on top of each other, sometimes it's just awe-inspiring. They really understood basic things like, I found this memo from CIA where they discover in the 50s, even before this operation, they say, okay, this thing has been partly blown. There's a rumor going around in Berlin that this is a CIA operation. That is actually a good thing, because it means that the news value of the full exposure is lower because the rumor is already out there. So they really were quite clever in this situation, CIA, in understanding some of these weird contradictory effects. And of course, for me personally, having the memos in so many cases just made me a lot more humble when it comes to interpreting forensic artifacts, even if they sound like, it look like very high value artifacts. We don't have the memos.
Question from the audience. Have you considered putting together a disinformation/active measures archives with all of the material you've uncovered and recorded, and allow us to go dig at it?
Absolutely. I did that actually. So the book has close to around 80 or something URLs in the endnotes to archive.org, full documents. So you can have all the Czech case files, all the Nazi files, and many, many more from other operations in different languages, in Bulgarian, German, Czech, a few Russian documents. It's all up there. And you find the links in the endnotes of the book, and I will also make the full collection public sometime soon.
Okay, people, just remember, don't forget, go buy the book. It's very important to support some of the people doing this all amazing research. The least you can do to give back to Thomas is go buy his book and support the work he's been doing. Last question quickly. To be able to unravel this misinformation campaign has been amazing. Thank you for your work. What was your hypothesis going into the investigation, and did that change as information got gathered and things changed? Give us a sense of going in and coming out where your mindset was.
Yeah, in this case, Bittman had already written about the operation in his memoirs. Now, he didn't have access to the 2,800 pages of case files. He wrote this mainly from memory. But because he ran the operation, his memory was quite good. So we have this. There's a lesson there. The lesson is the best history you get if you have both. You have eyewitness accounts for the atmospherics and for some details that didn't make it into the files. But at the same time, you need the files for the dates and for some of the things that people forget. So that is something that I try to do throughout. Get some Stasi files, but also talk to Stasi officers, for example. So I will say one thing, if I may. The book will be out in Russian as well. Should there be any Russian old, first chief directed officers who may still be alive, who get their hands on it, I'm just going to say it here as well. I'd love to talk to them, just to get the facts straight.